So there's this old problem in the philosophy of science that can be asked this way. Are there natural kinds? That is there sort of structures out there in the universe that are there for us to discover, and that's science's job? Or rather, is nature just sort of big, fuzzy, gray area mess, and so all science is really doing is drawing somewhat arbitrary lines around some of those groupings in order to make it easier for us to navigate? The way Plato put the point was, can science carve nature at its joints? Now, if you want what's probably a clear success story here, something that illustrates this point really well, probably the best thing out of science is the periodic table of elements. This just seems to provide so much structure, and so much of this seems to just fit naturally in terms of how the elements present themselves to us. It doesn't seem like this is something that we're imposing on nature. This seems like it's built into nature itself. But even if that is a successful example of natural kinds, and there are some people who would push back and say that it's not, there's other areas of science where maybe it's not quite so clear. So I want to talk today about biology. Now, way back in the day, Aristotle said that life came in very distinctive kinds, and he wanted to categorize them. He went out there and looked at all the different sorts of animals and tried to put them together in a comprehensive organization. And for over 1,000 years, biologists followed in Aristotle's footsteps. But of course, that all came to a crashing halt when Charles Darwin came along and proposed that species don't stay the same over time, that organisms evolve. And of course, if organisms evolve, then it's going to be a hell of a lot harder to classify them. But in spite of that, I think most people still have an instinct that there are natural kinds out there in biology, natural structures, and biology's job is to figure out what those structures are. So, for example, we still teach kids in elementary school that we can group vertebrates into the following 5 categories: mammal, bird, reptile, amphibian, fish. This is pretty simple and straightforward, and of course you all know that it's a little bit more complicated than that, but those 5 categories do seem like they are real. They seem like they are natural kinds, and that when we classify an animal in one of these categories, we are carving nature at the joints. But it turns out that those categories are actually not quite so clear-cut either. We used to classify animals according to their morphological characteristics, that is basically their body type, the basic shapes that their bodies took. But nowadays, in the post-Darwinian world, we tend to classify animals in terms of their evolutionary heritage, what their most recent common ancestor was. Now, the most current dominant approach to this kind of classification is called cladistics. I'm not going to get too much into the technical side of things, but suffice to say, according to cladistics, a really confusing thing happens. When you look back at how animals evolved and you group them according to their most recent common ancestor, there's no clear way to delineate fish from mammals. And so this creates a dilemma for us. Either we have to classify a whole bunch of mammals, including human beings, as fish, which should be obviously awkward, or alternatively, we have to say that the category fish isn't a natural kind, but instead is a sort of human invention. Now, like I said, I think the problem with the first option is rather obvious. If humans count as fish, then we may successfully preserve the category of fish as a natural kind, but it doesn't seem particularly useful anymore. So much of why we like that simple 5 classification scheme that we give to kids is because there really is obvious practical uses for that kind of scheme. But if humans and other mammals are fish, then all that practical use goes out the window. The problem with the second option is that it has potentially huge ramifications for our understanding of science. If we're going to say that fish aren't natural kinds, but still qualify as a legitimate category in science, then that opens up the door to the prospect that science isn't really so much concerned with the natural world and with the order that natural world presents to us, but is also, at least to a certain extent, concerned with the way that human beings construct categories within nature. So if science's job is in part to study the things that we as human beings impose on nature, then that might seem like a bullet you're willing to bite, but recognize that that means that science's much vaunted objectivity is potentially undermined by that strategy. If human-made categories are not just a part of the way that we do science, but a part of the subject matter of science, a part of what we study as scientists, then it's not quite so clear that science can claim that objectivity, that disconnection from the concerns of human beings, and instead is just looking at nature the way it actually is. So, what do you all think? Should we just stick with the category fish as a scientific category and accept that some degree of subjectivity is inevitable in science? Or should we bite the bullet and accept that, contrary to all appearances, human beings actually are a kind of fish?